The restaurant wasn't loud. That was the strange part. It was the kind of place where the lighting is soft and the chairs are heavy and people speak in measured tones because they've earned that kind of quiet. You were there for a reason, a family dinner, maybe a milestone. You'd made the reservation weeks out. Halfway through the main course, he said it. Not loudly, not with any apparent malice. He said it the way a man says something he's rehearsed enough times that it sounds casual. A slight correction of something you'd said, something you'd done, something you'd built, offered across the table with a small smile and a glance at the others to see if they'd caught it too. You felt it before you processed it, a tightening just below the sternum. Your fork moved to your plate with a little more deliberateness than necessary. You didn't look up immediately. When you did, your eyes were level, your face composed. Nobody in that room knew what had just passed through you. Someone at the table laughed softly, agreeing with him. Someone else shifted in their seat. And then you did what you'd spent 60-something years learning to do. You let it go. You nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. You redirected the conversation. You kept the evening intact. By the time dessert came, the moment had dissolved, and you had handled it with the kind of grace that takes decades to develop. You drove home with the radio off. 3 days later, you called him. You said what needed to be said. You moved forward. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you told yourself that was the right thing to do, that this was maturity, that this was what it meant to be the bigger man. Maybe it was. But there's something most men miss in this moment, something that sits beneath the surface of the forgiveness itself, something that forgiveness, offered too quickly, quietly buries. Let's be precise here, because precision matters more than comfort. When a man over 60 forgives quickly, genuinely, or performatively, he often tells himself a story about strength, that releasing the grievance means he's above it. That moving on is evidence of psychological largeness, and sometimes that story is accurate. There are betrayals that don't warrant extended grief, and there are men who genuinely process injury with remarkable speed and clarity. But there is another version of this, and it's the version that doesn't get examined. For a significant number of men in this season of life, rapid forgiveness isn't a sign of strength. It's a strategy for avoiding a more difficult confrontation, not with the person who wronged them, but with themselves. Forgiving quickly sidesteps a question that is genuinely hard to sit with. What does it mean that this person, someone I trusted, someone I let in, was capable of this? That question has weight. It implies judgment was imperfect. It implies vulnerability existed where strength was assumed. And for a man whose entire architecture of identity has been built around competence and discernment, that implication is uncomfortable in ways that are difficult to articulate. So the forgiveness comes fast, not because the wound is shallow, but because sitting with the wound requires sitting with the discomfort of having been wounded at all. There's a second layer here, and it's more subtle. Many men in their 60s and 70s have accumulated enough social and professional losses. Friendships that faded, relationships that collapsed, partnerships that dissolved, that they've developed an unconscious economy around the people who remain. The calculus goes something like this: there aren't that many people left. Conflict feels expensive. Forgiveness is cheaper than the alternative. This is not pathology. It's a rational adaptation to real circumstances.
But when it operates below awareness, it starts to erode something important, the man's own sense of what his trust is worth.
When forgiveness is reflexive rather than considered, it sends a quiet internal message that violation of this man's trust carries no real cost, not to the other person, and eventually not to the man himself. That's where the damage accumulates, not in any single act of forgiveness, but in the pattern, in the slow diminishment of the internal standard that made the man who he is. Before we go further, let's complicate this, because the opposite of quick forgiveness is not wisdom. It's often just another failure mode dressed in principle. There are men who've turned grievance into architecture, who've built their identity around the catalogue of wrongs done to them, who use the language of standards and boundaries as scaffolding for something closer to bitterness, a refusal to extend grace not because they've calibrated their trust, but because they've given up on the possibility of being known without being used. That's not strength, that's just pain that's learned to disguise itself as philosophy. The real territory here is narrower and more demanding than either extreme. Consider this: not every betrayal is equal in weight or intent. A man who reveals a confidence out of social carelessness is not the same as a man who reveals it as a deliberate act of sabotage. A business partner who makes a bad decision is not the same as a business partner who makes a dishonest one. A son who disappoints is not the same as a son who deceives. The categories matter enormously, and the wise response to each is genuinely different. There are also betrayals, where quick forgiveness is not a compromise. It's the only sane response. When the person who wronged you is also grieving, also struggling, also under pressures you were not fully aware of, extending fast and genuine grace is not weakness. It's accuracy. It's a clear-eyed recognition that human beings are complicated and that a single act of failing doesn't always represent the full character of a person. What distinguishes the mature response isn't speed or delay. It's deliberateness. It's whether the forgiveness comes from a considered place or a reflexive one. Whether the man has actually looked at what happened, not to prosecute the other person, but to understand what the event revealed about the relationship, about the other person's character, and about his own willingness to remain present within it. The cost of quick forgiveness isn't paid in the moment of forgiveness itself. It's paid later, when the pattern repeats, when the same person violates the same trust in a slightly different way, and the man finds himself forgiving again, faster this time, because the template is already established. That's when the internal contract becomes clear. Forgiveness here is automatic. And automatic forgiveness is something other than forgiveness. It's surrender. Let's get practical, because strategy without application is just rhetoric. The first thing a man needs to do after a significant betrayal, before any conversation, before any decision about forgiveness, is sit with it long enough to answer three specific questions. Not to ruminate, not to rehearse grievances, but to genuinely assess. First, was this a failure of character or a failure of circumstance? These are genuinely different things, and conflating them leads to wrong conclusions in both directions. Character failures, dishonesty, deliberate manipulation, consistent disregard for the man's dignity warrant a fundamentally different response than situational failures born of pressure, fear, or limited thinking. One requires recalibration of the relationship's depth. The other may require only a direct conversation and time. Second, has this happened before in the same form or different forms? A single instance of betrayal can be anomalous. A pattern cannot. If the current event rhymes with earlier events, the data is speaking, and the man owes it to himself to listen to what it's saying, rather than insisting on the narrative he preferred to believe. Third, what does this relationship actually cost me, and what does it give? This is not a coldly transactional question. It's an honest accounting. Some relationships are worth significant effort to preserve because of history, because of genuine depth, because of mutual investment that has real value. Others persist through habit, obligation, or the inertia of long familiarity, and in those, the cost of repeated forgiveness accumulates without return. Knowing which kind of relationship you're in shapes everything about how you respond. Once these three questions have been genuinely answered, the actual conversation, if one is warranted, becomes far more precise. Not a confrontation, not an accusation, a statement of what was observed, what it cost, and what is required going forward, delivered without heat, without theater, and without apology for the clarity itself. There is a way to forgive that doesn't require pretending the betrayal didn't happen or didn't matter. Forgiveness, in its most sophisticated form, is a private act, a decision to release the emotional weight for the man's own sake, not a performance of reconciliation for the other person's comfort. It does not require the relationship to return to what it was. It does not require the pretense of restored trust where trust has not been earned back. And it does not require speed. A man who forgives on his own timeline, after genuine reflection, having made conscious decisions about what the relationship will look like going forward, that man hasn't compromised his dignity. He's exercised it. Here is what the men who handle this best have in common. It's not that they've become harder or less feeling, it's that they've developed a clearer relationship with their own standards, not as rules imposed from outside, but as expressions of who they actually are. A man in his 60s has, if he's lived honestly, accumulated a set of experiences that have taught him something precise about himself. He knows what he can tolerate and what genuinely diminishes him. He knows which relationships have been growth and which have been cost. He knows the difference between discomfort that builds something and discomfort that just erodes. That knowledge is not a set of beliefs, it's lived data accumulated over decades. What forgiveness given too quickly does is override that data. It says, in effect, this knowledge I've earned about myself and what I require, I'm willing to set it aside right now to smooth this over. And there are moments when that trade is reasonable. But when it becomes the default, when it becomes the pattern, the man starts to lose contact with his own center of gravity. He becomes accommodating in ways that don't serve him, and he wonders, somewhere beneath the politeness, why certain relationships feel increasingly weightless. Legacy is built on consistency, and consistency requires a man to know what he stands for, and to stand for it calmly across time. This doesn't mean rigidity. The men who carry real authority into their later years are not the ones who've never compromised. They are the ones who've been deliberate about when they compromise and when they hold, who have made conscious choices rather than reactive ones, who have extended grace from a place of genuine reflection rather than anxious conflict avoidance. The men in his life, sons, younger colleagues, friends who are watching, even when they don't say they are, they notice this. Not always consciously, but the quality of a man's self-respect has a texture that others can feel.
A man who forgives everything quickly, who never adjusts his proximity to people who've demonstrated they'll misuse it, who absorbs betrayal without consequence, that man is not seen as generous.
He's seen over time as someone whose regard carries no weight. Contrast that with the man who is known to be genuinely forgiving, but not automatic, who extends trust deliberately, who recalibrates when the data warrants it, who holds his relationships to a standard that reflects what those relationships are worth. That man's forgiveness, when it comes, means something. His presence in a relationship is understood to be earned, and the people around him, even those who might in another context take advantage of a more accommodating man, treat him with a different quality of care. That's not a manipulation strategy. It's just the natural result of a man being honest about who he is and what he requires. Think back to that restaurant. The tight chest, the level eyes, the measured pause before the redirect. That moment contained something real. A genuine wound, a genuine decision about how to carry it. The question isn't whether to forgive. The question is whether you gave yourself enough time and honesty to understand what you were actually forgiving and what, if anything, needed to change because of it. What does it cost a man, over the long arc of his life, to forgive in ways that are designed to protect others from discomfort rather than designed to reflect his own truth? The men who figured this out aren't harder to know. They're easier, because what you see is what's actually there. No performance of generosity concealing unprocessed wounds, no carefully maintained cordiality masking slow resentment. Just a man who has decided, with clarity and without apology, what he will hold on to and what he will release, and who made that decision himself, on his own timeline, for his own reasons. That's not forgiveness as a gift to someone else. That's forgiveness as an expression of who you are. And at this stage of life, that distinction is everything.